The full name of Stephan Salisbury's book is Mohamed's Ghosts, an American Story of Love and Fear in the Homeland. Salisbury is the senior cultural writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's covered numerous stories ranging from the Pennsylvania prison system to unrest in Ireland. He was a finalist in 1995 for the Pulitzer Prize. He speaks about the shocking mistreatment of Mohamed Ghorab.
I want to talk a little bit about actually the subject of this book, Mohamed's Ghosts, because it's, I think, a very typical story that tells us a lot about what's happened in this country in the last 10 years. In May of 2004, on the morning of, I think it was May 27th, it was a bright morning in Philadelphia, and Mohamed Ghorab, who was the imam of a small but quite vibrant mosque in a working class, non-Muslim, non-Arab, non-Middle Eastern, non-South Asian neighborhood called the Ansar Allah Islamic Society, got into his car with his wife, Miriam Moomin, who was an American citizen, a Moroccan-born American citizen. The imam was an Egyptian immigrant. He was, at that point, had overstayed his visa. And with their daughter, who was in the 7th grade, they were taking her to school. They drove about 15 minutes to the school in the neighborhood of Bustleton in Philadelphia, if you know Philadelphia. And they pulled up to the front, and it was a typical morning with parents and children all swarming into the school, Greenberg School. And Eliza, I call her in the book, that's not her real name, but as a minor, I respected her right for privacy. She got out, walked up the steps. She met her friends. She turned around to wave goodbye to her parents. And at that, and her mother, Miriam, turned to the imam and said, "Okay, we can go." And at that point, they heard a scream of "Stop, stop!" And then the imam looked around. He couldn't figure out what it was. All of a sudden, they saw some lights. And before you knew it, there were 30 or 40 FBI agents, immigration agents, local police surrounded the car, all armed. Children ran screaming from the street. Parents, teachers ran into the school. It was chaos. They pulled the imam out of the car, hustled him off into another car where he was pushed in the back seat and driven directly to York County Prison, which is about 3 hours southwest of Philadelphia. He was never to return home again. Over a year later, he was deported. Miriam, his wife, was driven. She can't remember now whether she was driven in her own car or a police car, but in any event, she was driven back to their house, which was next door to the mosque, where a massive Joint Terrorism Task Force raid was underway. About 100 JTTF force people, agents, had entered the mosque with automatic weapons, with dogs. They searched everywhere. They carted off computers. You can imagine every paper, tapes of the imam's sermons. They went next door to the imam's house. They tore it apart. They went through every drawer. They looked inside every pillow on the couch. They tore up the beds. They ripped out the closets and did the same. They took papers, bills, everything that anybody would have that was actually movable. In the ensuing weeks, it became, well, let me back up a second. This raid was immediately all over the newspapers. But no one really could understand what the reason for it was. The local U.S. attorney, who actually is now running for Congress in a district outside of Philadelphia, Patrick Meehan, said that terrorism was not a factor. Yet he managed to mention that they would be examining all the available evidence to determine whether or not terrorism might in fact indeed become an issue. The attorney that the imam engaged couldn't find out really what the reason for the raid was. At first, he learned that the agents were using a warrant that was issued to the Internal Revenue Service that was looking for financial information, apparently related to some very vague tax fraud investigation. But that didn't really pan out, and the IRS said that they really were not leading the raid. The FBI said they weren't leading the raid either. Meanwhile, the imam's in prison, and the mosque has been effectively destroyed. And it would take a long time to totally destroy it, but this began a long slide. While the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office were saying that it was not terrorism was not a factor, they were in fact filing documents with the Immigration Court saying something quite different. They were saying that they were investigating a terror training room that the imam had set up in the mosque. They were investigating the storage of AK-47 assault rifles in the mosque. And while the agents were in fact going through all of this material, Miriam Moomin, the imam's wife, was right there, and they kept asking her, "Where's the terror room? Where do you keep the guns? What do you do with all the money?" And she would say, "What do you mean all the money? There is no terror room. There are no guns. There is no money. There are only debts. This is a house of worship." And as she told me later, she said, they wanted to know whether or not she was really Miriam Moomin. Wasn't she, in fact, Afia Siddiqui, who was a Pakistani neuroscientist who had been wanted by the FBI, was subsequently arrested several years later in Afghanistan, actually. And she said, "No, I'm Miriam Moomin." And it went on like this, around and around and around, and she finally said, "This is an outrage. I'm a Muslim. Since when is being Muslim a crime?" That had absolutely no effect on the agents at all who proceeded about their business, although they did not arrest her. In the subsequent months, it became very obvious to the people who were in the congregation of the Ansar Allah Islamic Society that there were informers throughout the congregation. Immigration authorities had an unerring ability to find anyone who had even the smallest hint of an immigration problem. And rumors that people knew were rumors were coming back from immigration authorities who were then interrogating congregants about the truth of the rumors. And the only way the rumors would get to the immigration or the FBI, for that matter, was through informants. The young man who took over leading prayers for Ansar Allah found himself subsequently arrested as a result of his failure to register at Temple University. He was a Palestinian immigrant who was in this country on a student visa, and I think, pretty much found himself, ran afoul of the database that Homeland Security had set up, the Student Exchange and Exchange Visitors System database, which keeps a track of, at this point, probably 6 million different foreign visitors and students in America. They arrested him. He was taken again also to York County Prison, where the imam had been taken. An Algerian immigrant was confronted by immigration agents because he was providing a home for his brother, who had entered the country illegally. This Algerian, who was a congregant of Ansar Allah, also found himself arrested after he refused to become an informant for the FBI. They said, well, you know, you can help us by going back and reporting what's going on and going to these other mosques and reporting what's going on. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And they said, okay, well, we can file charges because, you know, you were harboring your brother who was in this country illegally. And Nassim said, okay, go ahead. And so they did. And he was arrested. All these people were jailed without bail, ultimately, and deported, every single one of them. Over the course of the next year, probably a dozen people were deported from this mosque. And as a result of this, the people who had made this such a lively place found themselves terrified to be associated in any way with it. And so they began falling away, and the congregation began dwindling. As the congregation dwindled, the ability of the mosque to meet its basic expenses became more and more problematic. And so after about a year, the landlord evicted the mosque from its building, evicted Miriam and her children from the house next door. It was a package deal. She'd been desperately trying to hold this congregation together for the course of the year, and it had trouble, a lot of trouble. For one thing, she was a woman, and that caused problems with some people, some of the attendees at the mosque. She had a very volatile personality and argued with some other people. But ultimately, her problem was that she was a Muslim living in the United States in 2004, 2005, in a tainted, with trying to hold together what had become a tainted mosque. And I just, there are a lot of things I could talk about, but I actually wanted to, if people don't mind this, I would actually like to read a little section of this book, because it gives a flavor of what, how insidious the kinds of things we've been talking about and hearing about today really functions in a living space like this masjid in 2004. So if that's okay, I would like to do that. I'm going to read a little section in which the Imam, Mohamed has been in jail for almost a year. The mosque only has about another few weeks of survival left. There are only maybe a dozen congregants left out of it. At one point it was lively. 200 people came to Ramadan breakfasts in 2002 and 2003. And now they're down to about a dozen people.